Hello and welcome back to another tutorial. My name is Mike Davies, and in this video I'll be showing you how to create a new layer from a selection using GIMP. I'll be using GIMP version 2.10.22, which is the latest version of GIMP at the time of this tutorial. Before I get into that, don't forget to check out my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, I have tons of GIMP, Inkscape, and Darktable tutorials on here. You can also become a DMD Premium member, and I have tons of free software help articles, so definitely check that out. You can enroll in my GIMP 2.10 Masterclass from beginner to pro photo editing on Udemy. You can enroll in any of my Skillshare classes by visiting gimpschool.com. And as I mentioned, you can get more with a premium membership to Davies Media Design. And I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So I'll be using a couple of free photos for this tutorial from Unsplash. I'll include these in the description. I simply clicked the download free option. I do recommend going with something like the medium option here. I went with the original size and then had to scale it down later, so just go with the medium size. To fully understand this tutorial, I just want to start off with a basic concept when it comes to selections inside of GIMP. So selections in general can be created by using selection tools. For example, any of these selection tools here inside the toolbox. You've got your shape selection tools here like rectangle and ellipse, your freehand selection tools like the free select, scissor select, and the foreground select tool. I do have an entire tutorial dedicated to the foreground select tool. And you've got select by color and fuzzy select. So all of these create a selection area. So let's just click on the rectangle select tool and click and drag to create a selection. So when it comes to selections, the selection area is not going to be tied to a particular layer at first. So for example, this selection area here, the rectangle selection area, is not tied to any layer in particular. It's just sort of floating here on top of the composition. So if I wanted to fill this in, for example, with the color white, it's going to fill the selection area in on whatever active layer I'm on. So right now, my image layer is my active layer over here in the layers panel. If I come up top to the blank layer, that is now my active layer, so that is going to be where this rectangle is filled in. So if I click and drag this white color inside the rectangle select area and release, you'll see that this white rectangle shows up on this blank layer. So I'll hit Control Z. So that's going to apply to any selection you create. It's not really tied to anything. It's just going to interact with whatever layer is your active layer. So that brings me to my next point, which is relevant for this tutorial when it comes to creating a new layer from a selection. So that is going to be that the selection area acts as a boundary, and any action you take while there is a selection active on your composition is going to affect the pixels only inside of that selection area. So everything outside the selection area is deselected for the most part. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I'm not going to get into it for this tutorial. So if I hit Control-Shift-A to deselect that, I've created a selection area ahead of time for this tutorial. Let me come over to the Paths tab. I do have a tutorial on how to save your selections as a path, but that's what I've done here. So let me just come over and convert this path to a selection area. I did use the foreground select tool to create this, so that's under here, under the foreground select tool right there. So here we have a selection area in the shape of our subject. Let me come back to the layers panel. So let's say we wanted to cut out the subject from this photo and put it on a new layer in the shape of our selection. There's a few things I can do here to accomplish this. So first off, I can either copy or cut this and then paste it, and that's going to paste it as what's called a floating selection. So first I need to make the layer that contains the pixels I want to copy the active layer, so that's going to be the image layer. So now with this selection area selected, if I hit Control-C or go to Edit, Copy, that's going to copy the pixels inside of my selection area. And then when I hit Control-V or go to Edit, Paste, that's going to paste the pixels inside the selection area as what's called a floating selection. So this is essentially a set of floating pixels that needs to be assigned to a layer. And there are a few options for this. So I can either assign this floating selection to its own new layer, which is going to be the first icon here, or I can anchor this to the layer below, which is going to be my image layer. So that's basically just going to return those copied pixels back to their original layer. And finally, I can just click this delete icon, and that's going to delete that floating selection altogether. So it'll basically undo what we did. So let me hit Control Z to undo that. So here is the floating selection or the pasted layer that was created by pasting those pixels. If I wanted to add this selection to a new layer, come over here and click the new layer icon, and that will add those pixels to their own layer. So if I hide this image layer, you could see now the pixels that were inside that selection area from the image layer are now on their own layer. So let's hit Control Z to back up to before we did that. As I mentioned, we can also cut the pixels from our image layer and paste them onto a new layer. So to do that, I'll hit Control X instead of Control C. That is going to cut out those pixels. So right now it's going to be replaced with our background color. And if I hit Control V to paste, that will paste those back onto their own floating selection layer. And now I can do whatever I want with this, but I'm just going to come over and create a new layer, and that puts our cut pixels onto their own new layer. Something you may have noticed about this is that that floating selection layer that's being created is being created above the original layer. So that's not always the case. You can change where the floating selection layer is going to appear. So let me just back up. So this is the point where we cut the shape out by hitting Control X. Now if I wanted to paste this above the blank layer, all I have to do is come over and click on that blank layer and then hit Control V. That's going to paste this floating selection layer above the blank layer, and now I can anchor this to that blank layer. So with this floating selection, I'll come down here and click the anchor icon, and that will anchor that to the layer below, which is the blank layer, and now the pixels are on that blank layer. Let's hit Control Z to back up. So here we are back to the original composition. I do want to note that if you're on a different layer, so let's say you're on this blank layer, but you're trying to copy and paste pixels from the image layer, what'll happen if you hit Control C and then Control V is it's going to copy pixels from this blank layer, which this blank layer doesn't have any pixels, so it's just going to be blank, and it's going to paste those onto the floating selection layer. So now if I create a new layer from that, you'll see there are no pixels here. It's just a blank pasted layer now. So you do have to keep that in mind when you're copying and pasting from selection areas. Make sure you're on the exact layer that you want to be extracting pixels from and not on a different layer. One last thing I want to show you guys before I let you go is that there is a shortcut to all of this. So there is a shortcut key to just cut and paste things onto a floating selection layer. That's called the Select Float action. And you can access this by going to Select Float or by using the shortcut key Shift Control L. So this is the equivalent of hitting Control X and then Control V. So let me demonstrate. I'll come over here to my image layer, and I still have this selection area active. Now if I hit Control Shift L, that's the same as going to Select Float. That's going to automatically float that selection area above that image layer. So if I hide this, you can see it's cut out that shape from inside the selection area, and it's pasted it here onto a floating selection. And now we can do whatever we want with this. For example, we can add this to a new layer, and now we've added that selection to a new layer. The problem with this method is that it's only going to be able to float pixels directly above whatever the active layer is. So let me back up hitting Control Z. So by that I mean you can't do Select Float and have the floating selection layer appear above the blank layer. It's always going to appear above the image layer or whatever layer is your active layer. And the reason that's a problem is, let's say you did want to float it above the blank layer. So you click on that blank layer and hit Control Shift L. The floating selection layer appears above the blank layer, but it's taken pixels from the blank layer, and of course that layer is blank, so there's no pixels there, which means we didn't really copy pixels from this image. So let me exit out of that. All right, so that's probably everything you needed to know about adding a selection to a new layer and more, but that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. You can click the notification icon to be notified each time I have a brand new tutorial. You can also check out any of the links to my resources in the description of the video. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.